In this first story, we have an entry for the worst Session 0 ever. Should we even throw a log on the fire? This is the only campaign that I've ever ran where I had to stop it before it even started. It all began on Roll20. I was running a homebrew game requested by a regular player of mine. He DMs a lot for his other group, and the campaign he's playing in with me is only level 4. He's never played above level 6, so he asked me to run a level 20 one-shot. I thought it through and decided that a tournament arc would be a good way to get some insanely powerful characters all together. So I set it in a giant demi-plane so they could basically do whatever they wanted to that reality, like a massive soft playground for kids, but with fireballs. Because I needed some mighty enemies and a reason for this particular group to gather, I pitched that they were competing on behalf of the material realm against the champions from other realms. In other words, they had to play races native to the material plane. No Genesee or bird people. I also limited Wish to just the listed effects or replicating spells. I want to be clear that I listed all of these rules in the advert for the game. I recruit the players, set up Session 0, and we should be good to go. An hour before we start, Mr. Regular calls and tells me his daughter has broken her leg, so he's out. She's doing well now, just in case you were wondering. That was already a bad omen, but then the players joined. Our cast, the rules lawyer, who hated anything homebrew but joined a homebrew game. The donkey, who was extremely stubborn with no room for compromise. The anime enthusiast, who was the only redeemable character here, probably including me. And the misogynist, who joined the game only for enough time to find out I'm a woman and told me he doesn't play with girls. Rules lawyer kicks it off by telling me that this isn't how the demi-plane works. I tell him he's wrong because this plane was created specifically for the tournament by a god. He grumbles. Anime enthusiast wants to play a fallen Aasimar. I was fine with that since there was a good plot hook for conflict with the Celestia team. Rules lawyer argues that Aasimar shouldn't be allowed because they're plane touched. I point out that they are born on the material plane, and he wants to play a tiefling, technically also descended from a power from another plane. Lawyer doubles down, and Donkey backs him up, so now neither enthusiast nor lawyer gets to play what they want. Enthusiast says he wants to play a ranger. Donkey reveals she's also a min-maxer and is firm in her belief that rangers stink. I make it clear that no one will be punished for playing a weaker class or for choosing something for roleplay reasons instead of combat prowess. But they've already ruined his idea for him, and he goes quiet for a few minutes. Donkey decides she wants to play a cleric of a god she's homebrewed herself. I'm not really down with players assuming they can add their own homebrew, but I'm willing to hear her out. She describes basically Lyra, goddess of joy. I suggest she follows her, but no. She wants her special homebrew thing. Lawyer is practically frothing at the mouth. I suggest a compromise that where Donkey comes from, Lyra is called something different, the homebrew name, and worshipped a little differently, but she's still the same goddess. Nope, she's not happy with that. Anime enthusiast has been quietly doing his own thing and comes back with a character sheet. It's filled with homebrew magic items. If she's allowed to homebrew, I should too. I tell him no, and not to push it. He goes off and brings me back basically Naruto, a half-monk, half-warlock who was rejected by his village but now rules it. It's finally a character I can work with. I tell him it's good, and he and Donkey start nerding out together. It breaks the tension enough that we can start to get back to making a character sheet for everyone. Lawyer decides to play a wizard. I'll just wish that we win. No you won't. Wish is limited. That's completely unfair. You've completely nerfed my character. As if the basic uses of wish aren't still very strong. Donkey hands her sheet in while he's popping off. I think she was hoping I wouldn't notice the bard spells she picked. My goddess lets me cast them. No, she doesn't. How am I meant to make a character if you have all these preconceived notions of the world? And at that point, I was done. I kicked Donkey and Lawyer from the Discord server, invited enthusiasts to fill a spot in one of my regular campaigns, and never looked back. I should have shut it down when they bullied enthusiasts out of his character, but I was in denial, convincing myself that I could claw it back. Well, at least you could say that the Session Zero did its job. It just goes to show that sometimes you can't avoid a horror story, but you can limit its impact. Imagine if OP went on to have a game with this party. I'm sure it would have been a bigger disaster. So was this the worst Session Zero that you've ever heard of? Let me know your thoughts on the situation as we move on to the next story. In this next story, OP gets bullied on several occasions. The first time I read through this, I actually had to take a break due to how frustrating it gets. See if you all can get through this in one go. Let's throw a few two-faced logs on the fire. About 6 months ago, I started playing a 5e game with people that I genuinely thought were my friends. The group was 6 players plus our DM, and we all had met in a West March style game over a year ago, except the Bard, who had been in my own weekly game before I had met the rest of them. We were playing over Discord/Roll20. During character creation, the Warlock and I came up with a backstory that would have our characters be friends before the events of the campaign for a good while. But things rapidly started going downhill for me when we actually started playing. Basically, the first thing we learned about our party's wizard was, "Oh, I just hate clerics." And so the wizard was immediately a jerk to my cleric for being a cleric. This was not something they ever brought up in our Session Zero, but I figured, whatever, I guess they'll be hostile towards me in the beginning, but we'll work it out eventually. Now, this player had played several characters in other games I was a part of, all of which I enjoyed, but no matter what happened, this character just treated mine with unpleasant, thinly veiled contempt. Now, knowing full well about all of this, our Warlock started a relationship with the Wizard, where it was obvious that the Warlock had feelings for the Wizard, but the Wizard just wanted them for physical pleasure. Now, it would be one thing if it was just a weird/toxic relationship that they wanted to roleplay with each other, but it ended up taking over the entirety of their roleplaying to the point where they would get annoyed if any other members of our party tried to interact with their characters. Even me, the Warlock's in-game friend. Later we found out that Warlock was cursed and had a very good chance of dying if it was left unchecked, as their warlock power would eventually become too strong for their body to handle. Now here's where our DM comes into play. Being our resident holy person and friend to the warlock, I asked to do some research on the curse during downtime between missions. I end up spending weeks in game doing this, and when it came to making a roll for it, I rolled a natural 20. So our DM gave me a potion recipe that we knew for sure would be safe, and it would actually give them a damage immunity on top of stopping them from dying. But while this was happening, our DM had 2 other members of the party have alternative ways of dealing with this curse, without having to do the research or put any effort in it at all. They just inherently got to know for some reason, despite me having to spend my downtime that I could have been using for other things to get the same thing. Now, these different methods were definitely riskier, and there were a lot of unknowns, so when they asked me what they thought we should do, I suggested that we go with the method that I had found. I didn't know it at the time, but the warlock apparently took this as me hijacking their personal storyline, a stance that I still don't understand. Now this is where the bard comes into play. This bard started pulling the wizard and warlock into an alternate voice chat to roleplay with them during sessions. Now doing this occasionally would have been fine, but it got to the point where they were doing it several times a session, and since our DM would go into that alternate VC with them, the rest of us were basically just made to wait until they came back to do anything. On top of that, they would absolutely refuse to do anything worthwhile with their characters or the story unless they were in a voice chat that half the party wasn't in, eventually leading me to wonder what was even going on with the story because I was so far out of the loop. Now all of this was frustrating and was making me feel uncomfortable, but I figured these people were my friends, and if I just talked to them, we could get things worked out. I'll spare you the details, but after I tried to talk it out with them, I was basically told, "Nothing's going to change, get over it." From there, these 3 players would go out of their way to make sure I was excluded from as much of the events of the story as they could. I would keep expressing my discomfort, but they would just keep doubling down whenever I said something and mock me for saying anything about it. After a while, my diplomatic expression of how I felt just turned into snarky comments because I didn't know what to do anymore. It all came to a head when in the space of 2 sessions, we saved our warlock from the curse, but during the climactic boss fight, our wizard had the boss under a hold spell while me and the other 2 characters that I haven't been talking about were in melee range of said boss. Now, one of the boss's minions was right in the wizard's face, but had failed to do a single point of damage to said wizard. So with the boss up next in initiative after them, our wizard decided they needed to drop concentration on the hold spell to use invisibility to get away from the creature that hadn't touched them. The boss then proceeded to use his super move to hit me and the other 2 party members for over half our health. Luckily, none of us died, but I was extremely upset with our wizard for doing something so selfish, and when confronted with what they did, all they could say was, "Yeah, I did that." So I let my frustrations out on them, calling them out for being a consistently self-centered jerk of a character because that had been their entire character up to that point. As I spoke to people about it, I was shocked to hear them defend the wizard's actions. Of course it was the warlock, the bard, and the DM that defended them. The wizard, eventually messaged me saying that they had intentionally done it to get my character hurt, if not killed, and unbelievably, they still continued to defend the wizard after we all learned about this. Apparently, they had done it because they were annoyed about me expressing my frustration with their character, even though they had said nothing about it prior. Things went from 0 to the nuclear "I'm going to try to get your character killed" option. Then the very next session, the bard went behind our backs and promised to give an item to an NPC that was part of an organization that had sent an agent of theirs to a temple dedicated to my cleric's goddess who had desecrated it. The item was taken off the body of that agent and was in our bag of holding, which I always had on me because I kept track of its contents out of character. Then, when I said I didn't want to give the item to this NPC, the bard storms off and tells the NPC that they should just steal it from my cleric. When I called them out on how that's not acceptable behavior, they tried to claim that it was their responsibility to give back the item because they got the final hit on the agent that desecrated the temple. Then I told them that this reasoning is ridiculous because we all fought the dude and they just got even more angry at me. The very next day, our DM messages me saying that I was making people uncomfortable and if I didn't change that I would be kicked from the game. I was confused, but I wanted to make things work, so I offered to do things differently and even retire my character to play another one that could fit in with the group better. But when I asked the DM to promise me that if I did this for them, that they would at least try to be less exclusionary in how they played the game, they freaked out and kicked me from the game anyway. As frustrated and angry as I was at this, I just decided to move on and to try to learn from this experience. You'd think that this is where the story ends, right? No. Remember that West March style server I met a majority of these people on? Well, we were still a part of it, and 3 of us, including myself, were DMs over there. So for the next 2 months, I just tried to do my own thing on the West March because I didn't want to think about what happened in that weekly game. While I still wanted to be welcoming and not hold a grudge towards them, they apparently didn't feel the same way. They unfriended me and started gossiping to other people that were a part of the West March game. They wildly exaggerated and lied about things that I did and started being super passive aggressive to the point that I was in a session with our wizard player and they just start talking halfway through a sentence every time I spoke. I asked to have a meeting to try to figure out what I needed to do to make things better between all of us, and DM said, "Okay, we'll do that." But just 2 days later, the DM, who was also the head DM of the West March game, go figure, contacts me saying that I shouldn't take part in a session he's running because the wizard player and the warlock player were also signed up for it and they were going to be uncomfortable if I was there. After a short discussion, I just agreed because I didn't want to stir the pot. Later, that very same day, I realized I have no access to the Roll20 for the West March, and this DM tells me that instead of doing what they said and having a meeting with me, that they had a discussion with the other leadership in the group without my knowledge and convinced them to kick me. Then they wouldn't so much as answer my messages asking why they had done that. So that's my story. This is definitely a tragic tale. It's really troublesome when you don't really have a way to clear your name, but I think this ending is unfortunately for the best. You had so-called friends that violated your trust multiple times. It's much better to have a clean break from them rather than trying to get things to work with them. It's obvious that they don't like you, and you can't really do much about that. All you can really do is move on and find a new group that isn't so toxic. What do you all think about this situation? What would you do if you were in OP's position?